Association. Thank you so much for joining us for this very special podcast today with Texas Senator Bob Hall. Senator Hall, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Matt, for having me on. I appreciate it very much.
You are a lion of the Texas Senate. You've really worked on the issues that are facing our state and our nation for so long. And last year, I got the privilege to hear a presentation that you and some others gave at the Texas Capitol on the threat of EMPs to our country, to our power grid. And with the recent solar flare or whatever it was that knocked out cell phones here in the United States, I wanted to take this opportunity and harness kind of the thought train and talk about an issue that you have worked on for so long. Please explain to everyone what EMPs are and how they pose a threat to every American.
Okay, it's hard for me to get it all in a very short time period, but I'll do my best. EMP stands for electromagnetic pulse. EMP. It is a phenomenon that we discovered back in the late 50s, early 60s with our high altitude nuclear testing that we did because our nuclear weapons got so big we couldn't keep setting them off above ground or below ground in Nevada. And so we tried outer space, not realizing that this pulse that was given off was as large as it is. We knew there'd be one, but they didn't know it'd be that big. Well, the first time they did it, it knocked out the power. This is what I'm talking about is sending a nuclear weapon a couple hundred nautical miles into space and then detonating it. And what we learned was a pulse that comes off of that when the gamma rays impinge on the particles in the atmosphere, knocking the electrons loose, that then interact because of the magnetic field of the Earth to induce. It's in an induction process, electrical induction process, huge currents into anything that's electrical in particular. And it knocked out the power grid in the islands. We tried it again, did the same thing, and we quickly came to the conclusion we had to stop the testing. The Russians were doing the same kind of testing over Kazakhstan, and they were knocking out the power grid over there. Now, it wasn't that big a deal in those days because electricity was more of a luxury than it was the necessity that it is today. But they had to stop, and that's how we ended up with the high altitude nuclear test ban treaty very quickly with no opposition and complete agreement between us and the Russians that nobody could do this in there. Fast forward to more recent times when electricity has moved from being the luxury it was in the 50s and 60s. I mean, of course, there was a necessity for it, but back then you could still drive your car without electricity. You could tell what time it was without electricity, and we didn't have the dependence on handheld communication devices that we have today. Today's environment has elevated electricity to be the second most important thing to sustaining life that there is. The only thing more important than electricity in our society today is air. You'll live longer without food and water and medications than you will without electricity. And so that puts a different spotlight on the importance of maintaining electricity. And I'm talking about an EMP that as a weapon, and we do know it's been developed as a weapon. We have it. We have one ourselves, and we have the ability to use it. When General Schwarzkopf was going into Baghdad, just before the attack, he requested permission to hit them with a preemptive strike with EMP. The president turned him down because he said it would be too devastating on a civilian population. Go conventional. And so they did. And we know Absolutely. The Russians have it. We know the Russians have it. We know the Chinese have it. The North Koreans have it. And we know this because when the Soviet Union collapsed, there were dozens of high-ranking military officials that defected to the United States, and they wanted to feel welcome. They wanted to bring something and say, I'm worth you letting me come in. And so they brought boxes and suitcases full of classified Russian war plans and documents. And from that, we learned that Russia, China, and North Korea all had in their war plans at that time a preemptive strike on the United States if we ever went to war. And so it's well documented. We well know it. We know it's real. And not only is it from a military standpoint, but there's a natural version called a GMD, geomagnetic disturbance. It happens all the time. Most people call them sunspots. Scientists call them coronal mass ejections. These are nuclear explosions that take place on the sun and hurl them into space as the sun orbits. And only when we're in the right location does it affect us. But it has happened and it has affected us. It's not a theory. We know it because in 1859, there was a major coronal mass ejection called the Carrington event. You can Google it, look it up, Carrington event. You'll be amazed at the damage it did to our telegraph system. Destroyed it coast to coast, here and in Europe. It was so fierce that telegraph operators were burned, sent to the hospital, and railroad tracks were bent like pretzels and set railroad ties on fire. And we've had other more modern times events that have knocked the power grid out up in the Northeast and affected operations numerous times. And so these are all real threats out there. But
we essentially have an open border. Joe Biden has said that the border is secure, and I believe Kamala Harris said the border is secure. Well, you and I both know that's a lie. 10 plus million illegals in 3 years under the Biden administration tells us we have open borders. How much more is the threat of EMP, or how more serious is the threat of EMPs to Texas and to our power grid with these open borders?
Oh, absolutely. Because it's not just EMP. Our power grid is very, very sensitive. It's susceptible to all kinds of attacks, whether it's cyber, physical, a nuclear EMP, or a man-made EMP device that can take out substations and other equipment here and there. With the huge number of military-aged males that have been coming across, and if you haven't, people did not recognize that in watching just the newscast, then you got to be brain dead. But these are coming across, they're fit, they're unaccompanied, there are no children, there are no women with them, and there are hundreds of thousands of them from multiple nations, including China and the Middle East, Africa and South America. But it would not take many of them. I think in Texas, because Texas has its own electrical grid. That's the one big thing we have going for us. There are some congressmen who are trying to nationalize the Texas grid. We cannot let that happen. The organizations that oversee the rest of the country, NERC and FERC, are just shills of the power companies. It took them 10 years to develop a spec to prevent squirrels from shorting out transformers. It took them about that long to come up with a spec to keep tree limbs from shutting down our power grid. They are ineffective and worthless, and we do not need to be under their control. They are more worthless than most of the federal government.
Speaking of ineffective and worthless, I'm sorry to cut you off. Speaking of ineffective and worthless, last year in the Texas Senate was Senator Lois Kolkhorst introduced Senate Bill 147 to ban China and other hostile foreign entities from taking control of Texas farmland, oil and gas, other mineral resources. Representative Todd Hunter refused to let that out of his committee for a vote, and I still don't understand that one. But in the previous session, Senator Parker now had introduced the Lone Star Infrastructure Protection Act, I believe. And you have worked on this issue to harden our electric grid. How do we do that?
We're going to have to get the governor's attention on it, and we're going to have a different mix in the House to make this happen. We've gotten it out of the Senate. I've gotten a bill to protect our grid out of the Senate every session I've been down, every session since 2015. We get it over to the House. In the last couple of sessions, I had almost every senator a co-author on it. They recognize it. I've talked enough about them, and they understand that it is a credible threat to us and that we are being irresponsible if we don't do something. But it's going to take a change in the House. It's going to take a change in the head office. It's not The power companies, that, as you well know, are very powerful lobbyists, and they have convinced the governor that it is pie in the sky, that it won't, it's not going to happen, or it costs too much if we did do this, and so on. And I'm sure that the argument the power companies give him is it will drive the cost of electricity through the roof. That's a lie too, because we do have a couple of power companies in this state who recognized, when I first started talking about this, they started doing their own research, and they came to the conclusion that it was credible, that it was actually true. One is CenterPoint down in Houston. The other is CPS in San Antonio. The good news with CPS in San Antonio, Joint Base San Antonio was well aware of this, was run by a general that knew about the threat, and he got the city and the power company together with the base and said, let's join together and see what we can do for our community. And so they have been developing a hardened grid for power going to the military base. They recognize the necessity from a strategic defense standpoint. So they've got there. CenterPoint down in Houston, they said, we think we could do this. And they saw some federal money available. They got it. And they actually built a hardened control center, just like a military operation. It's their backup operations center. It's in use. It's been in operation for several years now. Is designed to military specs, and it only cost them 6 to 12% more than if they had built it non-hardened from scratch. That's peanuts. The second thing they did was they had a really smart engineer, and he said, I think I can design a substation that's hard. Well, not only did he design a substation that was hard, and I know what he did was right, because he used some of the same design techniques and materials that we used when I worked on the Minuteman missile program and hardened the Minuteman missile back in the 60s against an air attack by the Russians. But that substation, he used new technology. That was one of the keys. That all the arguments have been made is coming from a mindset that has never implemented any new technology in anything they've done. The electricity you get in your house today in the business is generated and delivered to you no differently than it was the first day it was put online. A little bit of changes, but no real new technology. The biggest thing in technology is when they shifted from manual switching to computer generated switching when the transformer went down. That's the biggest change they made, was use of computers there. But he came up with using fiber optics for controls, which are impervious to an EMP. It significantly reduced the cost and allowed him to produce a substation that's hard. They now have their third generation of this unit, and they can build it and build it for a 1/4 the cost of the old style of a non-hardened substation. That tells me a lot about what we could be doing if the power companies would choose to do so. They could do it today. They could start building it. CenterPoint is actually deploying these hardened substations as backups to existing substations in key locations. So if something were to happen, it goes down. They're cheap enough, a fourth of the cost of them. They're in place already and ready to go. There are other devices that have been built for the military. There's a manufacturer in Austin, ETS, that has built the kinds of devices that are needed to be adapted by the power companies for neutral blocking, for grounding, for capacitors that can be put in to divert this pulse as it comes through and protect the major parts of the system, at least to allow us to be able to rebuild. We could do it today.
You keep mentioning the military. You served in the military, didn't you?
Yes.
I was thinking you had, as I was reading back through your bio, thank you for your service. You keep talking about national security, and I think that's one of the things that maybe many people don't think about whenever we think of the threat of taking out a power grid. You talked about General Schwarzkopf. Well, the first way to cripple a nation is to take out their power grid. And yesterday, whenever cell phones went out, I thought, man, if you think that your cell phone going out is bad, just imagine our whole power grid being taken out. And with open borders, I thought this was a great opportunity to talk about it. There's another issue that I think ties to open borders and national security that's happening right here in the Permian Basin. They are wanting to store, the federal government is wanting to store high level nuclear waste above ground. And I've talked with Monica Perales from Fascinolam Ranch. She and Tommy Taylor have really led the efforts on this through Protect the Basin. Why would we want to store high level nuclear waste above ground with open borders and confirmed terrorists walking across into our country?
Well, the average American would not. The folks in charge that have caused us all of the civil unrest and all of the rogue government gone wild that has you used to be that the federal government would do stuff and I'd get mad. I mean, I'd get, why in the world would they do something like that? I got to tell you, Matt, what they're doing today scares me. It scares me. It's not that I don't like it. The whole thing fits together with what was created between George Floyd and the fabricated riots that took place to set the country up, the fabricated pandemic that was set up to help destroy society, and the massive effort to unseat our society with the woke policies of no gender identification. These all fit together. These are not independent things that are just happening. They're all designed to take down America and to set us up for this. And so it does scare me that the corruption that's in the FBI and the Justice Department, they are so corrupt. I'm just got through reading a major section on the J6ers and how they fabricated testimony, took video and recut it, cut out parts, and used it to convict when the raw footage would have proven that the people were absolutely, totally innocent. Matt, this is what's happening in Washington. And I think that what we're talking about of setting us up with this nuclear waste being stored such it is extremely vulnerable in an area that if something were to be done to it, it would be devastating to our oil and gas production, absolutely devastating to it. But I don't think that's a mistake. I think it's being done on purpose to bring down Texas and our country, because you bring Texas to its knees from an economic standpoint and you cripple the other states. You bring Texas to its knees from a political standpoint, and the rest of the country will collapse right behind it. It's only if we can stand strong and get our economy strong, keep our basin strong with the oil and gas production. As Trump said, we're going to drill, baby, drill. And that's what we need to be doing, not storing nuclear waste up there. It can only take a handful. We've got hundreds of thousands of military age men that have come across this border that I have no doubt are not here by accident, and they didn't come here to work in the fields. They didn't come here for a better life. They came here for a military purpose whose time has not yet come, but it is coming.
Absolutely agreeing. With open borders, known confirmed terrorists coming across our borders, and how many that we don't know about, these military aged males coming into our country, obviously not seeking asylum, and then the federal government wanting to store high level nuclear waste in the middle of America's most prolific oil field. It would cripple our nation for centuries if something were to happen.
Oh, absolutely. No, it just been a century. It's forever. I mean, it would be a total restructuring out there. And what makes it even more absurd is there actually is a use for what they want to just put into storage, creating a weapon in a location that over time somebody could very easily, with a physical attack, with a handful of men. I'm just a handful. It wouldn't take many at all to turn it into a wasteland out there with destruction of the facility. But instead of that, we could be solving our capacity problem in electricity throughout the nation, our reducing our transmission problems by having small nuclear weapons, microgrids, using the fuel that's in those rods. See, the plants today only use about 5% of the uranium in there. The other 95% could be used in the small fusion units that would be built in communities tied together. You reduce the transmission line along transmission lines by serving each community tied together, backups for each other. We'd have a much more rigorous electrical system, much more dependable, hardened against nuclear, an EMP attack, and no reason to do nuclear waste storage except in small amounts as a supply chain. And so that could be better solved, and the government knows it. They know how to do it. They know it could be done, but nobody is doing it on purpose. It's not an accident, and it is no accident that they picked the Permian Basin, because that is the easiest way to bring Texas to its knees economically, is to create a disaster in the Permian Basin and take down our oil and gas production.
You're absolutely right. And this push to put Texas's energy grid on the national grid to connect us nationally. Chewy Hinojosa, Senator Hinojosa, he has been one of the ones here in Texas to push that, and I have railed against that for the very same reasons that you're talking about. Yesterday gave us an opportunity really to think about if you're concerned about a solar flare or an attack on our power grid or whatever, crippling cell phones. Why would we want government mandated electric vehicles that we're not able to charge on a power grid that's solely powered by unreliable wind and solar, mostly imported from China, while we leave American oil and gas in the ground? It would cripple a nation. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. But again, just back up one step, Matt, and look at it in the context of everything else has happened. It fits perfectly with the plan to take down America. You're going to create an incredible demand on our electric system that cannot be met by solar, wind and solar, a tremendous demand that would, if you were to swap out all of our gas-powered vehicles today for electric vehicles and provide that energy with the unreliable wind and solar, and you got rid of everything else, there is not enough acreage in Texas. Think about that. Not enough acreage in Texas to put enough windmills and solar panels, if you covered the entire state, could still not meet the demand that there would be. So it makes no sense at all. And what really bothers me is nobody's questioning that. Nobody is saying, wait a minute, does this even make any sense at all? They just grumble and grouse about, oh, well, that so on. And we find that the electric vehicles, look what happened. The weather gets a little cold. They don't work. We got the major rental car unit places that were real big on these things are rapidly selling off their fleet of electric vehicles, cutting back on them significantly. But these programs that are driving us in directions that is nothing but chaos in the end, driving us away from you take the environmental laws that have been rules that are put in place that shut down our coal-fired plants for no reason at all, no good reason. It just forced them to shut down, limited our gas-fired plants to a small percentage of their maximum capacity. All of those reduce our ability to produce electrical energy in there. Absolutely. Not being able to produce, and at the same time encouraging things like Bitcoin. And I'm not opposed to Bitcoin, but it's a huge demand on electricity. Now, if there was anything anybody ought to be concerned about in the global warming scenario, it would be Bitcoining because of its demand for power. And yet nobody ignores that completely. Absolutely. You know, it's just like everybody ignored the fact that George Floyd had at least 6 things in his body, any one of which could have killed him. But the only thing they wanted to focus on was the officer who was following his training orders, instructions on how to have maximum strength on an aggressive person.
Yes,
But they
sir.
ignored everything else. We're doing that. We're doing that right now. Nobody wants to pay attention to these things that have done. So we are pretty much right, as I heard somebody describe it the other day. We are the frog that was put in the cool water, and the heat's being turned up a little bit at a time, and it's about to boil. And we aren't going to be able to jump out of the pot if we don't start doing something and start very quickly. And one of that would be to absolutely stop the deployment of the nuclear waste in the Permian Basin.
Sure. And the other is to secure our borders. And, I mean, we could go on from there. You've been leading this fight for so many years, not just here in Texas, but across the nation. Cannot say thank you enough, Senator Hall. Where can people find more information about the threat of EMPs?
Well, they're in my Capitol Hall reports on senatorbobhall.com, all spelled out, just senatorbobhall.com under CHR Capitol Hall reports. Written, many of them are up there, and so they could go there to find it. We've talked about it on Facebook quite a bit. But that would do it. Also, they can call my office. Call my office in Austin, 512-463-0102, and set up a meeting. And I'd be glad to come give a in-depth presentation on the threat and the solutions and what we could do.
Appreciate you, Bob. Thank you so much for joining us today, Senator Hall. Thank you for all you're doing. We appreciate you. To everyone who's watching, God bless you all. God bless America.
Thank you, man.